So hope, optimism, imagination, creativity, all of those things that you can think about that live on that same space. Because I think they get defined as these sort of floaty luxury emotions, but they are very gritty and very tenacious. They meet us in our darkest moments. And if we can understand that and recognize that, then we can facilitate our own healing. So there's that sort of redefinition project. And then the second thing was explore some of the barriers to joy. I think one of the things that gets missed when we're talking about trauma and the traumatized nervous system is that we can actually become resistant to joy and all of its related emotions and experiences, because when our system is wired for hypervigilance and fear, joy and creativity and hope ask us to lower our guard. And that runs counter to the traumatized soul, essentially. And so that is a really key piece of awareness, because I think a lot of the time people bump into joy in what they see in positive psychology or whatever, and they experience this resistance, but they don't talk about it. And so what they end up doing, unconsciously or not, is saying to themselves, this isn't for me. Or at the very least, this isn't for me right now. This is for me when I'm healed. And so if we can sort of figure out what those barriers are, and I identify 6 of them in the book, I call them joy thieves, then we can strategize how to negotiate with the thieves so that we can gradually, carefully learn to bring in joy again, to let it in. And when we do that in these little ways, then we can gradually move up to accepting larger joys. There's so many times I've seen a client who says, okay, I'm in my healing process. These positive things are happening to and for me, and they don't land. And I can't celebrate and I can't lean into that. And I'm afraid. I'm waiting for the other shoe, all of these things. So how do we kind of learn to bring it back in? So that's the book. And kind of similar to Unbroken, it has all these client stories. It has a lot of my story, losses and things I've been through. And then also tools and exercises for, let's do this. How do we negotiate with these thieves? How do we change our lives?
Beautiful. So first of all, the closest question now is, of course, what are these thieves? So maybe
Yes.
you speak a little bit about that first.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll run the list and then I'll give you a little example of each. So we have hypervigilance, which is sort of the hallmark of trauma, emotional numbing, fear of loss, fear conditioning, guilt, and shame. And so you might have one of these, one of them might be the leader. You might have all of them. But just to give you an example of each of them really quickly. So hypervigilance is this idea that your nervous system is wired and waiting for the next threat. And so if you think about, a sniper on watch, all you're doing and your nervous system is scanning and scanning and scanning and waiting and waiting and waiting. So anything positive, humorous, silly that comes in just gets pushed away. We don't have time for that. We are watching for threat, and anything that is going to get us distracted from that is dangerous. So push it away. So that's hypervigilance. Emotional numbing, I think, comes out when if you have, as we know, another hallmark of trauma is emotional overwhelm. And so if you have an overwhelm, one of the body's brilliant, amazing coping mechanisms to deal with that is to numb. You numb, you dissociate, you disconnect. The problem is we don't do that in a vacuum. So when we're trying to numb anxiety or fear, we tend to also numb all of the other emotions. And so this is kind of that person who, as I explained a minute ago, is saying, okay, good things are happening. I got promoted. I'm in a new relationship, but none of it's landing. And I think that can be because you have this emotional numbness that's saying, again, it's dangerous to feel too much. It's dangerous to kind of let go. Then fear of loss, I think so much of trauma, whether it's an actual death or not, so much of trauma and healing from trauma is about understanding what you've lost and how to cope with that grief. And this is my experience so acutely. This then changes your relationship with everything else in your future. And that can radically change the way you relate to things that you have, whether that's a job, a relationship, success, anything. And what that means is that you have the good thing happens, and you're so afraid to lose it because you know acutely how quickly that can happen. that you don't let in any of the joy, or maybe a tiny bit of it, but then you sort of spend the rest of your time rehearsing the loss to give yourself the chance to feel like you can handle it when and if it does happen. Fear conditioning happens when you have, I think often something good is happening, or you feel like your life is good, and then you have a trauma and you feel this sort of humiliation, almost like I should have been prepared. And so I'm conditioned now that when good things are happening, that I have to brace for the next bad thing. And this can become, as you know, a whole worldview where you say, this is karma, this is how the world works, which is not true. But if that's your worldview, then that's going to change the way that you experience any of the good things. And then guilt, again, when you have loss, or let's say you have the world going through an incredibly tender moment as it is right now, if something good happens to you, sometimes there's a tendency to push it away because you know that other people are suffering. And those could be in your inner circle. That could be a loss that you suffered. And now you're thinking, oh, I just felt happiness and I feel guilty that I'm happy because I just lost this person. Or it can be, I know that there are people suffering in another part of the world. How dare I feel joy at my life? And then shame, I think, is sort of metastasized guilt, where you have become aware, or you have come to believe that you are deeply unworthy of joy and all of its related experiences, so much so that when they come in, you push them away again because you say, like, that's not for me. I'm broken. There's something wrong with me. I'm flawed. I'm bad. So those are the thieves.
You're right. So now we will come to the negotiation. But before we come to the negotiation, there's something interesting that I've heard listening to you. Is it seems like, and maybe you can share how you look at this, that also I see a lot in the groups and the people I work with, is like the trauma creates part of our worldview and kind of creates a spin in our perception. And you said this before, hypervigilance, for example, or some of the others also, that suddenly I don't see the world as it is. I see more the world through the filter of my past. And I want you to, maybe if you can speak a little bit to that process, because that can create a whole worldview all the time that I'm looking through. And so I see some things and I don't see other things. And maybe you can speak to how you look at this.
Yes, I love this question because when I was early in my sort of trauma studies and trying to understand just what is this thing that we are wrestling with? What is trauma? I started to come up with this concept. I called it, like, we're haunted by a different ghost, because so much of the focus is on the thing that happened, the singular event. What is the trauma? What's the stressor? What's the thing that happened to you? And that, of course, matters, right? I'm not saying that it doesn't, but it seemed like there was this excess that wasn't accounted for. And I started thinking of it as, I don't know why I got that image in my head, but like a ghost that's behind the first ghost, a second ghost that we're missing. And it's the idea that it's not just what the trauma was, but how that trauma stamped your world with meaning. Because it's never just the isolated thing and then you cope with the isolated thing. It's how did that isolated thing shatter a structure of meaning? How did it change the way you view yourself in the world and your role in the world? How did it change your view of spirituality? Sometimes I think there can be a contraction. You may have before had this expansive view of the world and the universe is kind of inherently good or maybe neutral, but then something bad happens and you have this contraction of like, no, it is bad and I have to stay vigilant to that. And I don't think we focus on that enough, whatever we call it, the second ghost, the different ghost, the existential crisis after trauma. But I think that we need to understand that traumas stamp our world with meaning, and therefore, of course, they sort of stain our worldview. And that can come out in these much more sort of subterranean ways, that you wouldn't find in a listing of symptoms in the DSM.
Because for me, that's an important point. It's like, first of all, I love that you call it ghost. And in one of my books, I also call this like the intergenerational trauma and the collective trauma, that there are many ghosts from the past that we have been born into that we don't even know because they are the water that we are swimming in. And then we say, oh, which ghosts? And then I say, yeah, but a lot of the filters that our society is looking through, that we often say, okay, that's how the world is. And we say, yeah, but maybe there are many ghosts of all the trauma that our ancestors couldn't process, that we have been born into a world full of ghosts. And that's why I love that you brought this up as a ghost, because I really truly feel that that's true. That disembodied information becomes like a ghost-like experience, and it colors my worldview. It colors how I see you. And that's why I think humility is so important, because it says, okay, that's how the world appears to me, but it's not that that's absolutely how the world is.